Sarah, can you move the slide? Okay, thanks. Just a reminder that this is a free webinar series developed by a group of regional networks in the province and provincial support organizations for literacy as well. It's intended to support LBS practitioners with presentations on topics that are important to them. These are the English language webinars are presented for LBS practitioners annually, and we've been doing this since 2015. All webinar presentations, as Stacy said, recording, links, and transcripts can be found on the Pop-Up PD Resources for LBS Educators site. And if you ever have an idea for a webinar topic that you would like to see us explore a little bit more, please do send us an email to echannel@contactnorth.ca. Okay. So before we start with the presentation, I'm just going to read a statement of recognition. While we meet today on a virtual platform, let's take a moment to recognize, respect, and acknowledge the importance of the lands we occupy and from which we benefit. Today, let's reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improve relationships between nations and our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Let's remind ourselves that wherever we are, we live on the ancestral and unceded territory of Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people. Okay, just give you an introduction to your presenter today, and it is Sarah Gill. And Sarah has been involved in the adult literacy field since 1996 and has worked as an instructor, assessor, trainer, and research. She is currently the executive director of the Adult Basic Education Association, based out of Hamilton. In her career, Sarah has focused on assessment, clear writing, and learning challenges, and developed the Learning Challenges assessment tool in 2005. She has since adapted it into the Learning Exploration tool. So I'll hand it over to Sarah now, and she can tell us all about what we can do to serve or recognize and serve learners with learning challenges.
Thanks, Heather, and thank you so much for the introduction. And thanks everybody for being here. I really appreciate you taking time. I know we're all incredibly busy. It's a very busy time of year and you have a lot going on. So I really appreciate you taking a full hour and a half out of your day to talk about this. And my guess is that, it comes up a lot in programs and with the learners that you're serving. And that's why maybe you put it at the top of your list today. So appreciate that. The slide deck itself is rather comprehensive, so I'll say that going in that I really wanted to make sure that you had a bit of a reference point. But as Heather mentioned, the resources will be posted, and they are going to include not only the slide deck, but some handouts for you to easily download. So navigating through a bunch of slides might not be well worth your time after today, but downloading the learning challenges checklist document or some of the strategy documents we're going to be talking about today might be a little bit easier. So please feel free to consume this webinar for the next hour and a half as you choose. Of course, take breaks when you need it because we don't really have the opportunity to build in anything formally. I'm happy to answer questions or react to any comments as we go through. Would love for you to share your experiences in the chat as we go through so we can learn from each other. Because ultimately, as adult literacy practitioners, you're doing this day in and day out. And a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today will very likely resonate with your experience to date. Some of the things you probably have a good understanding of already, and that some of the strategies you're already using with learners, and you may have some this worked, this didn't anecdotes for us. So I absolutely welcome that as we go through. And I think that's all. I just wanted to kind of mention those few things before we get started, because you'll definitely notice that the deck is rather dense as we move through it. Four things I want to touch on in our time together this afternoon. I want to start from a place of where are we coming from as literacy and basic skills practitioners, and thinking about the doing a bit of an overview of learning challenges. What are we seeing? What are some of the general types of challenges we might be supporting our learners with? A touch on the learning exploration tool. That's kind of where this training is coming out of. And then, of course, talking about learning strategies and a couple of the handouts that I had suggested. So let's start here. Let's zoom out. I want to talk a little bit about how this subject is positioned within our day-to-day work. And we know in our practice that the adult upgrading is built for this type of work. And when I say this type of work, I mean work that is very individual, that is completely learner-centered, and that is informed by the individual, their needs, their preferences, their background, and the challenges that they're facing, but also their strengths. And so when we have tools like flexibility and customized programming and individual learning strategy development, these are all things that live and breathe in our programs every day. The other thing I want to just these are foundational things when we talk about really hard stuff like learning challenges, is the fact that at the core, you as adult literacy practitioners are the strength of this program, right? Um, you are incredible in the work that you're doing, sometimes under a lot of stress because you're working with multiple learners with multiple needs, a very diverse set of learners. And so let's remind ourselves how awesome we are and the complexities that we deal with every day. So we're bringing that and those strengths and those experiences to our learners. Uh, the other thing we want to consider and remember today is that everyone is unique. And so we're going to be looking at a lot of different characteristics of learning challenges. And you might see yourself or a family member or someone you know in those different characteristics. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's your experience or that you have a learning challenge. But each of our learners are so individual, and they come with an amazing amount of strengths and talents and goals that we're reacting to. The next one is learning is dynamic. And we all know this because we're all learners. Some days we get it, some days we don't. There are ebbs and flows. There are things that kind of add to and take away from our learning experiences every day. And so recognizing that as part of this work is really important. But that also, of course, learning is for everyone. Our program wouldn't exist if we didn't think that. And so we want to, again, we want to meet people where they're at. We want to support them with their individual goals, because we know that people do that. They come into our programs and they're feeling maybe not very confident, maybe that they can't really do it. And by the time they transition to their next goal, they're ready. And they're ready because they have spent time in our incubator program. And finally, and certainly we're gonna talk about this a lot when it comes to learning strategies, is the how absolutely matters. The types of programming options, their learner plan, and the learning strategies that you work with them on are incredibly powerful if they are individualized. And so we're going to talk a lot about that today. So I wanted to start there. Hopefully, It wasn't too philosophical for you, but I tend to go there. But this is the base. This is where we're all coming from, and we're all coming with a lot of expertise already. And so that's what we can layer on top of the content today. Okay, we're diving into the pool. Let's take a look at learning challenges, and we're going to start with a couple of slides that start out in the strengths-based approach. This is where we want to exist from because there are so many things that our learners every day are coming to the table, coming to our classrooms with that is really astonishing, quite frankly. So, we're working with folks with multiple barriers that have had some pretty negative experiences, perhaps, and they still find a way to make that phone call, to go through an intake process, to develop a learner plan, and to get into programming. And so, because of that, because of those journeys, we know that they're coming with a ton of strengths. And recognizing those and leaning on them is obviously really important to our work. So these slides have a couple of them, and I would absolutely welcome kind of anything that you are seeing in your classes that is not on these two slides because there's probably a million of them. But in general, I would say a lot of learners are coming into class with a ton of perseverance because they have overcome so much in order to get there. And, they know what they want. They're in an adult learning program because they want to move on to their next step. And it's not always the case, but certainly oftentimes they do have systems in place, and then the program adds to that support network. The one I have in bold here, I think is so critically important, and that is just acknowledging the bravery that they're bringing to their learning every day. And also just this idea of divergent thinking, that they may be solving problems really uniquely, and that is so awesome to learn from and be in partnership with. So the strength of problem solving, of thinking about things with different angles, of developing coping strategies to get through their day that maybe you never would have thought of because you learn in a different way. So these are the things that we want to kind of think about. And I would absolutely suggest that strengths-based discussions are happening in your classrooms. I'm sure they are. Um, because oftentimes our learners maybe are not able to articulate what all of these different strengths are that they have. And that will be very, very powerful and useful as they move through the program and beyond. So any other strengths that you can think about learners in your classrooms right now that you're working with, by all means. I do have my chat kind of up here. And if you notice that I'm looking, I have a couple of screens and all sorts of things going on. So that's why I may be looking because I don't want to miss any of your amazing comments as we go through. So when we talk about learning challenges, we have to start with a bit of medical language. And so when we think about learning disabilities, now often learners in your programs may not be able to give you documentation about, a diagnosed learning disability, but they might certainly use this language if they've had some assessment or conversations in high school or even primary school. And so I wanted to start here because learning disabilities are essentially about how people process information. So it's about getting information, figuring out how to use it, putting it into your brain somehow, and getting it back out in the output that you were hoping for. So learning disabilities are congenital. So we know that they are due to neurobiological factors. I think that's the first time I've actually been able to say that correctly. So I'm just going to pause to congratulate myself. Um, they typically may present themselves in groups, but they are incredibly specific to the individual. And they may, of course, exist with things like mental health challenges, difficulties with focusing attention, these types of things. So learning disabilities do affect people in every aspect of their life, whether they are learning, whether they are at work, in their daily life. But the way that they affect them in different environments could change or be different, and it could impact the severity of those challenges as well. But it also permeates things like relationships or how they see themselves or, how much they believe that they can move forward with their goals. So there's also a lot of feelings, negative feelings sometimes in terms of frustration or, thinking about having negative experiences from the past. Um, yeah, thank you, Patrick. 100%. So often these conversations happen over time. Patrick's just commenting that, it can be difficult making assumptions as to what the challenges someone is facing, and they might not be so forthcoming with giving you that information. And so you're right. Sometimes it is through trial and error or could take a long time and really relies on relationship development before that person kind of opens up and shares more information about their experiences. So thanks for commenting on that. One thought here, sorry to go backwards, is, a lot of questions that I get at the network level is, well, how would an adult upgrading program be different from what I experienced the first time? And so, often I am doing a little bit of cheerleading about how amazing the program is because it is a bit untraditional from what they're thinking, right? The individualized programming, everyone's kind of working on their own thing. So there is a little bit of kind of awareness building to get them on board sometimes. Very quickly about diagnosing learning disabilities. So this is why, of course, we wouldn't use this language or be suggesting that we're identifying learning disabilities in any way. We're definitely not doing that because we are not psychologists or psychometrists. There is a referral service. If someone is in need of a psychoeducational assessment, I've provided the link here. We know that they are incredibly expensive. The field, of course, has lamented years and years go by, and we don't have funding to provide this resource. But there are occasions where you have a learner that it would be incredibly beneficial, and they might have the resources or perhaps support from family members in order to get that done. Why would this happen? Maybe for assistance at the post-secondary level, maybe for apprenticeship related supports, those types of things. So I just wanted to make sure that that was on here for you. Now, we're not necessarily going to do these sensitivity exercises, but I wanted to include them here just to give you a sense as to what we mean when we're thinking about auditory processing challenges, where someone might have some significant difficulty sounding out and spelling words, as well as other things that we'll chat about, and visual processing challenges. And so I typically, in workshops that I do, we do some duet reading where you read a little story, Little Red Riding Hood, and it looks like this, where I would have, of course, the corrected version, and you would be looking at that. So I'm just going to pause for about 20 seconds for you to walk through very quickly what you might read there. My hope is you're starting to feel frustrated. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived with her mother in a little cottage. This little girl wore a little red cloak with her little red hat, and for this reason, people called her Little Red Riding Hood. One morning, Little Red Riding Hood's mother called her inside. Little Red Riding Hood, here is a little basket with some bread and butter and sugar cookies. Please let me know what your experience was with that activity. And if you were brave enough to try and read maybe in your mind or even out loud as you went through that. But this is in recognition that, many people do struggle with decoding words very quickly. They may get quite jumbled, as we see in this sample. Next up, I wanted to show you some visual representations of what people have told me they see when they're reading text. So this is more in line with what we're going to be talking about with visual processing challenges, where someone might experience this top left graphic here on the slide, where they're seeing rivers of white instead of full words. Or the bottom example there is where it seems to blur or spiral or maybe shake or move in certain directions. So I just wanted to preface that, you might hear learners explain some of the challenges that they're facing with some of those words, and that's going to be a bit of a flag. Okay. Lori says, I couldn't get past the raisin pimple colder. Oh, thank you. So instead of using the term learning disabilities, we use the words learning challenges. And it's really intended to mean that things are happening and they could be affecting both academics and someone's personal and social life that are likely due to how the brain is processing information and that really requires some individual strategies and accommodations to support or cope with some of those challenge areas. And so we definitely I wanted to create a term. I mean, I didn't create this term, but certainly it's what I use, that does inspire that, hey, yes, we know that things are happening, but there is hope and there are a lot of things you can use your strengths and you can use strategies to move forward and meet your goals. A few notes before we dive too far in, and I definitely said something about this in the beginning. It's really important to remember that most people would have a few characteristics of learning challenges, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a learning disability, and that they may have many challenges as well as other disabilities. And that, they really need to be supported individually. So that's definitely the key point here. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about 4 different categories of challenge areas: visual, auditory, and organizational processing challenges, as well as difficulties directing attention. So visual processing challenges is not a medical problem with someone's eyes. It's not a visual issue. It's about how the brain is processing visual information. And it will very likely affect someone's reading, writing, and math ability. So I'm going to take you through some major markers of these various challenge areas. This is what is in the handout, by the way. So when you download the handout, you're going to get just these key points as a bit of a reference marker for you. So someone with visual processing challenges very typically would have a physical reaction to print. And they will be able to tell you right away, like, they get headaches, they get very fatigued after a short time reading, or they get really red eyes, or their eyes water. They may be incredibly sensitive to light, so they would have a lot of difficulty with contrast, right? So even though I designed this slide deck with clear writing in mind, if I was working directly with someone with visual processing challenges, this would be very difficult for them because most of the slide has a white background and then the black text on top of it, which is 100% contrast. And so things like fluorescent lighting, if it's directly over top of them, is very challenging particularly when you have white paper and black text, or often on a screen, it's the same, right? So we have a very light background and very dark text. And so in the strategies, as I'm sure that I have foreshadowed correctly, we will be talking about lighting and exploring different options for contrast because that could have a huge impact for someone. As I mentioned when we looked at the example, they may find that text moves or shakes or falls off the page. They may see those rivers of white. And so often because they're experiencing those things, they might have some difficulty discriminating between different letters or words. They might miscue. Um, oh, thank you, Brenda, for adding that. Brenda's saying that's also very disruptive for people with autism. So some of the strategies that we talk about today might be applicable to other learners as well. So thanks, Brenda, for that. People with visual processing challenges typically have a lot of difficulty tracking text. So line to line, typically, as opposed to, but sometimes word to word. If the word spacing is too close, like less than one or one spacing, or it's too far, that becomes the issue. And so we talk a lot about, what works for them in terms of tracking and what tools or resources can they use for that. They may have difficulty remembering the look of letters or words, so that visual sight memory. So they may over rely on sounding words out using phonics, right? Which is great because often their phonics are great. However, they may have to sound it out and sound it out and sound it out again and again. If they make a mistake, it's probably quite similar, and then they'll catch themselves because it doesn't make sense in the sentence, like horse for house. Spellings are usually a really good phonetic alternative. Odds are, as an instructor, you can still read their writing sample, but there's going to be spelling errors in it. They're typically more rule-based, but you also may see kind of mixed upper and lowercase letters kind of randomly throughout a word. Because they're constantly decoding and encoding, as opposed to relying on their visual or sight word memory, they may spell the same word differently in the same document. They may confuse similar numbers or transpose numbers, like put it in the wrong order. Copying can sometimes be a challenge because you're trying to kind of figure out what the original says and then recreate it somewhere else. And working in columns can also be an issue for learners with visual processing challenges. So I wanted to showcase an example of some of these errors. So here we have a short writing sample. And at first glance, you might read through it and say, yeah, I kind of get the point. I understand what they're trying to say, which is the first thing that you will recognize when someone has a visual processing challenge, that you can normally figure out what they're trying to say. But on further inspection, when we read this over, it says my plan to reach a goals. Probably should be my goals there. So we have a word substitution, some grammatical stuff going on. We have an example of a rule-based error in the word stopping. I totally get that that word is stopping, but they've just forgotten the second P. Instead of can, they say can do it instead of can't do it, right? Again, identifying errors or self-correcting. At once, so we have a bit of a miscue there. So I will finish school and then smoking is a sentence fragment, and finish doesn't have the second I. And then again, kind of words left out, and then kind of stop smoking maybe. So again, I just wanted to point out that some major indicators here are the rule-based errors, some of the editing errors, but that ultimately you can kind of understand the main message of their writing sample. So Lydian has a question. Are learning challenges different from learning difficulties, or do they mean the same thing? And I would say that for me anyway, they absolutely mean the same thing. I tend to move away from language like difficulties. Uh, I'm not sure how different they are, but in my mind anyway, challenges are meant to be overcome. And so that's why that I prefer that language. But I think you're absolutely correct. They could probably be used interchangeably. It's just when we say the word learning disabilities where that's distinctly kind of the medical diagnostic term. Yeah, you're very welcome. So then let's compare what we see in terms of auditory processing challenges. So that was the Little Red Riding Hood sample, where it's more difficulty processing information that someone is hearing. It's not a hearing problem, it's about the perception of that information. Being able to kind of recognize and use those individual parts of speech and remember conversation, remember details that they hear. And oftentimes there could be some difficulty with the sequence of auditory information as well. So some major markers that we see with learners with auditory processing challenges is a lot of difficulty remembering information that they hear and explaining themselves to others. So finding the words that they want to say, kind of crafting, their thoughts into language. These are the learners that absolutely detest reading in general, perhaps, but particularly reading out loud, and has a ton of difficulty using phonics to sound out words. So often these learners have had pretty difficult K to 12 experiences um, because of the phonics challenges. And we see all sorts of things happening with their reading and writing samples. So they may kind of reverse letters, so kind of mirror images of each other, or transpose letters, which means putting them in different order. They may have a lot of difficulty understanding a piece of reading on the first go because they're really engaged with the decoding of the words. So they might have to reread that sample several times. And the major difference between what we saw in the first example with visual processing challenges is that the spelling errors are not good phonetic alternatives. In fact, it's very difficult to understand what they're trying to say. So letters may be added or missing or in the wrong order. They could have a lot of difficulty processing numbers as well. So they may say a number backwards or have difficulty with the order in oral drills can be quite a challenge. So here's an example of a spelling dictation. And we use this as an activity in the full learning challenges assessment tool, because if we ask learners to just give us a small writing sample, they of course are going to use words that they are very comfortable with, and then we would never really see what kind of errors they were making. And so learners that I've worked with are incredibly generous to me, and they go through this exercise so that I can ask them to spell words that they might not be familiar with, so that we can pick apart what might be happening in terms of how they're processing language. So here we have three different lists. In the first list, it starts out okay. Number 4, you might be saying, oh, wait a second, that looks like a rule-based error. I know what that says. Yes, I agree with you. So hang on to that. However, number 5, it's the word stiff. And instead of the spelling that you see there in brackets? Yes. It says Staic or E, not sure, F. So what I want to point out here is that if you look at someone's spelling of a word and you go, it's probably an auditory processing challenge. Certainly taken not taken out of context, taken with, way more information about the learner and the challenges that they're faced with. But if you're kind of nudging in this direction, this is a pretty good indicator. So if we look at the second list, number one is the word number, right? So we have some out of order things going on. You might say, oh, geez, there's uppercase and lowercase letters here. You're absolutely right. Does that mean that the learner is experiencing auditory and visual processing challenges? Maybe, but I doubt it. Odds are it's just one piece of the puzzle that is leaning towards primarily auditory processing challenges because they're really struggling trying to connect those sounds of that word to the letters in a way that makes the word number on the page. Okay. So in this example, we have transposition, so we kind of have an order issue. We have a substitution because it looks like an F at the end instead of an R. It's not a phonetic alternative. We can't understand what they're trying to say here. I'm also going to point out in the third list, we have the word kitchen, Kinchine. And in number 6, we have the word program. And a pretty consistent strategy with learners I've worked with over the years, particularly in person, is that they may really have difficulty understanding what letters they want to write down or that might be in that word. And then they end up doing the "Oh," and just kind of throwing stuff in there, like pasta on the wall, see if it'll stick. It's a little bit more difficult for them to do that if we're working virtually because they have to type it. But at any rate, that's certainly the strategy it looks like this learner might have spelled like this as a result of having ADHD. Yeah, certainly. I think people are very complex and the challenges that they are faced with are unique. And again, it just speaks to, we've got to meet them where they're at and try to figure out what they're really good at and the challenge areas that they're faced with. Oh, amazing. Okay, so we have a comment here that the visual examples are helpful. So good, I'm glad. All right, so because the visual processing and auditory processing tend to be quite close together, just a note here as to what separates them. And the reason why this is important is because the strategies that we would use for someone experiencing visual processing challenges compared to auditory are incredibly different. And so it's not just an academic exercise to feel out where they might be sitting here. It really is dependent on the learning strategies you pick. So that's why this is here. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Patrick. So yeah, in some respects, that is easy-ish to decode if you know that person and you know the context of that. I think coming at it with just the first and not your decoding of what that sentence is could be a bit challenging. Yeah, thanks for that example. So major markers with visual processing is the physical reaction to print, having to sound out things over and over and over again, but having good phonetic ability. And so the tracking issues, the columns, like those types of things are the major markers. In auditory processing challenges, this is more about individual parts of speech, being able to kind of listen to and interpret oral language, being able to communicate and share their thoughts. Those are the types of things that we see in those two separate areas. So you may have heard the term nonverbal learning disabilities. Of course, we're not using the LD word today, but I just wanted to make that connection because they're very similar if you're aware of or have experience with a nonverbal learning disability. Organizational processing challenges are typically challenges with time and space and executive functioning. So, using information, organizing, difficulty, maybe even with fine and gross motor skills. So penmanship, or, they might call themselves kind of clumsy or use that language. Major difficulties in things like memory or working within time limits or under stress, following or creating a schedule and being able to stick with it, understanding what to prioritize in terms of tasks needing to be done, or organizing their day or binder or anything like that, organizing details, and adjusting to change can also be incredibly difficult. Because difficulties with organization, it might leak into their writing that, some challenges with organizing, may have difficulty with direction as well, or their penmanship, forming their letters. Again, these things I have mentioned. Now, because this is a nonverbal, we're thinking about organizational processing challenges, not necessarily connected primarily to reading, writing, and math, but I am who I am. I'd like to show you an example. And so this particular writing style um, kind of provides some evidence of, geez, the organization of writing, trying to put thoughts together, it isn't indicative of all of the things outside of the three R's that I described, but it is somewhat of an example of just not understanding or not being able to work within those formatting things of a paragraph or a writing sample. So finally, our fourth topic area here is difficulties with focusing attention. Oh, yeah, thanks. Melody says, I found organize our graphic organizers helpful for organizational processing challenges. 100%. And I will just raise you some direct instruction. So, Melody, I'm assuming that you probably have some real favorites that learners have responded positively to. It can be very difficult for learners with organizational processing challenges to use a strategy very quickly, or to kind of internalize it and use it in other environments. So when we get to the learning strategies section, there'll just be some reminders about that has to be taught overtly. And I'm sure that you're doing that, and I'm so glad that you added that comment. Thank you. So I am going to use ADHD here, but not in a diagnostic way, just to showcase the connection. What we're really talking about, because our learners aren't necessarily coming to us with diagnosis, they but might have some markers or many markers that make it difficult for them to direct their attention. So when we think about the diagnosed condition of ADHD, you can see there the percentages, and more we're seeing women, older women be diagnosed because maybe they weren't diagnosed as a younger student. There are three types that someone might come to you and say that they've been diagnosed with: the hyperactive, inattentive, or most commonly a combined of the two. So I have a couple of slides here, I think maybe even four, so I apologize for the amount of text you see on screen, but I thought that they might be great resources to come back to. So someone having some difficulty regulating attention is going to have some difficulty focusing for a period of time, particularly if it's something that they're not super engaged with, uh, maybe like schoolwork. They might be very easily distracted, and uh, maybe not pay close enough attention to detail, so they might make mistakes, or report that they're making some of those mistakes to you. I often find that people experiencing some difficulties with attention will also have the ability to hyperfocus. It's like a superpower. So it can be a detriment if they get locked in and can't come out of it. But this hyper focus does allow them to really dive into something, particularly if a deadline is looming. So there definitely is a strengths-based approach here as well. They may report that they forget a lot of things, though, things that they need to do, or they've lost things, or, they just have that difficulty regulating the attention as to where they need to put it, as opposed to all the other, stimuli that's coming into their frame of reference. Your learners may also experience hyperactivity. So that's, not being able to sit still easily or having to spend a lot of energy in order to do that. So, as you're designing kind of your classroom spaces or considering your classroom spaces, are there things that allow people to get up and move? Are we encouraging kind of frequent breaks or standing while working or reading or things of that nature? Because it does help to create an environment where that is absolutely normalized. They may also report to you that they have impulsive behaviors. Oftentimes as we're developing relationships with our learners, they will share more and more about themselves and their experiences. And so they might divulge some of this information. And you might notice it as well. They might have some difficulty with turn taking in a conversation. They might let you know that that's something that they want to work on. This kind of considering the consequences. This isn't as easy as let's work on fractions, but could absolutely be making an impact on that individual. And, they may develop a trusting relationship with you to think about working in these areas as well. So, I mean, this would fall into kind of like managing learning, those types of aspects of our curriculum. I would say primarily learners that have difficulty with attention. Um, it mostly is centered around executive functioning. You'll notice the words on the page look a lot like organizational processing challenges. And in fact, the diagnostic statistics manual, where all of these things kind of live and breathe in a medical system, um, doesn't even recognize nonverbal learning disabilities because it's very difficult to really categorize. But there's a lot of commonalities with what we saw in the organizational processing challenges here in the focusing attention challenges as well. We also see this play out in emotion regulation. And so certainly if you've had learners experience this in your classrooms, where they're reacting with some pretty big emotions, having some frustration and might be kind of maybe oversensitive to criticism or certainly just sensitive to it, perhaps being frustrated or really kind of combating some big emotions within the classroom setting, excuse me, or they may report that this is happening outside of the classroom as well. So we'd love to hear from you in chat in terms of those kind of 4 different areas of challenge areas that you might be seeing in your learners. What percentage of your learners might be experiencing these things? Would love to hear that. And, are you seeing some challenges with focusing attention in your classrooms? Being a little facetious here because I tend to think you are. But, I would love to hear about your experiences. A very quick note on the learning exploration tool, which Heather talked about in the beginning of our session today. And that is just that the Learning Challenges assessment tool is a full kind of skills assessment. But within that, there are kind of educational interview pieces of it. There's a Learning Challenges pre-screen and a like a processing checklist markers situation. It's step 1 and step 2. And when I was thinking about my business plan this year, I was thinking about how I might share some of the development work that we've done. But not necessarily in a full-blown tool because so many of you have assessment tools that you love that work for your learners, and that spending 4 to 6 hours doing a very, very intense assessment might not be within your workflow parameters. And so the learning exploration tool is simply a very robust educational interview that builds in some of those additional tools specific to learning challenges. So if using a tool like that might be of interest, I have a training session coming up in January. I would encourage you to, if you're interested, certainly register, but a lot of the information in the first session is what we're covering today, maybe with a little bit more time. So you could register and maybe come to the second session, which is just looking at the tool and revisiting the strategies and things like that. So if you're interested and you have questions about how you might attend that, and what might be helpful, reach out to me by all means. And I'm pretty sure my email address is here somewhere, but we can get it to you as well. So when you get the slide deck, this is hyperlinked to the registration. So if you're interested, you can register for that training session. And again, you might consider either skipping or just half listening to the January 22nd session and coming in full force on the 29th. So before I move into talking about learning strategies, oh, thank you, Heather. Appreciate that. Just wanted to know if there are any comments or questions about the learning challenge areas we've covered, how they might present themselves in your learners, what you've seen in class. Just wanted to know if anyone had any comments. So Angela says, I let a couple of learners steer the sessions, if only there for 20 or 30 minutes, that is fine. So that's wonderful. So I think what I'm hearing is that they're kind of taking charge of that and maybe learning in really small chunks. So that can be an incredible strategy for some, certainly with those that maybe don't or can't sit for a long time doing some pretty intense work. Wonderful. Well, let's start thinking about big picture strokes. Um, we know as literacy practitioners that the more we know about a learner, the easier it is to craft a learner plan and strategies to assist them. And so that's where we start when we think about learning strategies is, meeting them where they're at. How are your how are you able to use your strengths in and outside of the classroom? And what are you bringing to the table? Sometimes it's literally naming them. And also, how are your challenges affecting you and in what environments? And so starting there, and that's about building, obviously, a lot of rapport and a lot of trust in that relationship. When we're thinking big picture, we may also want to remind ourselves that behaviors that we might see in the class might be the result of a lot of things that happened in the past, a lot of negative experiences working from a trauma-informed approach might be really important here so that we can kind of recognize that it might not be us. It might not be, that we're doing something incorrectly or that they're doing something wrong, but that the experiences are culminating in some of this frustration. So Brenda asks, how do you know if a person may be facing a learning challenge or just having difficulties because they are an older learner? Fantastic question, Brenda. And that's one of the reasons why when I was developing tools, it wasn't necessarily about diagnosing, It was about identifying certain gaps or certain challenges that they're faced with. Because the strategies that you might implement might be the same based on whether it is a learning disability or whether it is, um, some memory loss. You could make the case for things like an acquired brain injury, things like that. So, in my mind, it's about trying to figure out what that challenge is and starting somewhere with a learning strategy. These tools might be helpful, they might not. There is an element of trial and error for sure. But my hope is that some of these tools will allow you to be a little bit more specific with your trial and error as a starting point. It could also be a skills gap. I'm sure that you're thinking that too, Brenda, in terms of, how long someone has been out of school. And so skills gaps tend to show up a little bit differently than learning challenges because it's not necessarily how they're processing information, but it's what they know and can use in terms of their skills. So, but yeah, it can be a lot because adults are onions and they have so many layers. So I appreciate the complexity there. In terms of big picture, I had mentioned it earlier about any learning strategy needs to come with explicit instruction on how to use it. And where you might sit around a staff lunch table and discuss the new coolest app or the new Gen AI. And it's like, oh, cool, I'm going to download that and use it. And it's going to be part of my daily life by 48 hours from now. When we're working with learners with learning challenges, it's often the case that they may need very explicit instruction on how to use that tool. They need repetition. They need a lot of things to happen over a length of time. And then ultimately, when they use it on their own outside of the class, that's a huge win because they've internalized that and they've figured that out. The other thing I will say is that learning strategies might be awesome and technologies might be amazing for like 2 or 3 weeks. And then they might get bored and be like, this is not working anymore. And that's totally okay, particularly with those that have difficulty focusing attention. They might need strategies, new strategies every cycle, right? Every 3 or 4 to 6 weeks. And that's okay. Some of them they'll retain because they love them and they use them all the time, and others just kind of like fall away. The other thing we need to think about is managing the environment as best we can. And I have a slide coming up about universal design for learning. So critically important to think about, how we can create environments that work for a lot of learners, as opposed to creating individualized things every single time. Amazing question, Tom. So Tom is asking how you can distinguish between English as a second language difficulties and actual learning or listening disabilities. And the easy answer to that question, although frustrating, is all joking aside, when someone has a processing challenge, it typically is in their first language as well. And so we can ask them questions about how they learned when they were very, very young in kind of those primary literacy development years, normally grades as far back as they can remember to grades 4 to 6. And so sometimes we can peel that back. Now, is it possible to have a second language learning disability? Of course. But again, that's one strategy that we can use to try to feel out, is this specifically language based because they're learning a second language and that's incredibly difficult? Or is this a learning disability that permeates any language that they're going to learn? So that would be one of the things that we would do in some of the tools, is kind of talk about that early language development. So just to touch back on managing the environment, thinking about predictable schedules, is that easy in our programs? No. Um, but thinking about routine as much as possible for an individual, for a small group of learners, helping them predict change, and notice of transition, that task switching can be incredible for a lot of learners. So you might be able to kind of use that strategy across learners in your classroom. A quick note about some definitions. So when we say learning strategies, those are specific techniques that you might use, kind of customized to a person. An accommodation would be considerations or changes made, but that doesn't take away from the actual skill being learned. It just accommodates their learning needs. So an accommodation, an example of an accommodation might be, some extra time or a certain app that they're using. Again, they're still learning the same thing. They're still doing the same thing that you're asking them to do. It's just with those accommodations in place. And then assistive technologies are a kind of accommodation that just use digital technology, whether that's an app or an assistive device or all sorts of cool things that we have. A lot of these accessibility tools and assistive tools are being built right into the fabric of our daily lives now. For example, Google Chrome now has a reader built in. You just press a button and press play, essentially. So these things are more and more kind of permeating the mainstream, which is wonderful because it means more people will have access to them because it means they're typically free. So I just mentioned universal design for learning, and that is to create the best learning environment for all learners. And it's thinking about what potential barriers might come into play, what people might need, and designing your programs ahead of time as opposed to reacting to and accommodating learning when it's asked of you. And so there are three kind of components to universal design for learning. And Literacy Link South Central did a ton of really wonderful work in this area. And that's why you have a little screenshot at the bottom of this slide. And I'm pretty sure it's linked to the actual site if I know myself in terms of how I design slides. So I would absolutely recommend you going there and checking it out. There's webinars and all sorts of resources about this, but it's about engagement, representation, and expression. So that the learner drives what they learn, built into LBS. Wonderful. Representation is showing them and allowing them to digest information in multiple methods with different perspectives. And then expression is how they choose to offer you their proof of skills, knowledge, right? So, are they going to do a video as opposed to a written, as opposed to a presentation, those types of things. And so this is really wonderful when we're talking about learning challenges. It fits right in here because it's about designing learning spaces and activities with that in mind at the beginning. Thank you, Heather. Heather's got my back. All right. So in general, definitely consider the sensory inputs. It can impact a lot of learners with learning challenges, and other learners in general as well. So things like noise and light and distractions. Consider those things. Maybe ask for learner input on their experience in the classroom and encourage learners to explore, how they learn, to be a bit more mindful about what's annoying and what's amazing. Even recognizing those things in the moment as it happens. Oh, that really worked for me. I really like that. Or that was frustrating, or it made me anxious, or any of that stream of consciousness, like that thinking through and being mindful of their experiences as a learner, very helpful. In general, a lot of structure and notice of change, right? If they normally come to class 3 days a week and your center is going to be closed on the third day, making sure that they have a lot of notice about that. And really embracing using technology for learning. I mean, it's here, it's not going away. People have supercomputers at their fingertips very often. I'm not suggesting that there isn't a divide in terms of access to internet and access to devices and people's skills around digital technology. But the fact that so much technology is here and available to us, uh, utilizing that just makes a lot of sense. I know that many of us are not up at the front of the class offering lessons, but as we're working one-on-one with learners, offering things in a couple of ways. So making sure that we're explaining a learning activity and then following it up with written instruction is just a universal design technique, a universal accommodation that we can build in. Breaking things into chunks, tools, rubrics, checklists, schedules that you check back with them and help them use, incredibly powerful. And encourage them to take their time. If they need more response time, say, hey, listen, I'm cool with silence. I'm good. And then actually be cool with silence. That's kind of the kicker. It's amazing being supported in this meeting by ASL interpreters because they force me to take pauses. So thank you very much for that. I had mentioned a couple of times direct instruction. This is just the step-by-step model. Odds are you probably use this every single day, but itemizing it for learners is very, very helpful. Hey, I'm going to explain this new learning strategy, and I'm going to show you how I use it. And then I want you to tell me how you might use it. And then we're going to have like a couple of weeks where we just make sure we use it every day in class. And you're going to tell me whether or not you like it and how you're using it. And eventually, if you use it outside of the class, eureka, that's great. Okay. So those are the steps in direct instruction that you want to make sure are overt. Auditory processing, specifically, if you have a learner that's experiencing some of these challenges, communication is going to be a really, really big one. So again, you might want to explain and offer oral instructions, but they're going to need those written instructions. They're going to need instructions repeated, and they're probably going to need more processing time to accept instructions and to offer feedback. So if you sense that one of your learners might have an auditory processing challenge and you ask them a question and seconds go by without a response, please continue pausing. They're still trying to figure out what you've asked. Then they're going to craft a response and then they're going to say it. So getting comfortable with offering that time is going to be really important for a skill to develop. In terms of reading, you could try a phonics-based program. It just may not work. So I've worked with a lot of learners that are just like, this is how I'm supposed to learn it. And I'm just going to do the booklets again and again and again. And at the end of the day, I still can't read those words or spell them. It's like, okay. So instead, we really need to consider whole word approaches, memorizing full words, copying, writing things out a million times, using their smartphone, using dictation, all of these things, because their brain doesn't want to take a word and split it apart into sounds. And sometimes we just need to accept that and try it from a different angle. It is really difficult, particularly if we've learned successfully in that way, to think about different approaches, but it might be really important to consider. That's going to affect spelling as well. So things like word patterns or families, because they have a similar shape and are only changing one letter, or just simply considering how we use assistive technology to support you with spelling. How is that? How are you using at work? What can we do to support you? And thinking through those things in practical ways. In math, maybe color coding steps of a math problem because they might have really good visual memory, but not very good auditory memory. So trial and error here, but thinking about ways to lean into their strengths. And then in terms of accommodations, they will very likely need some visual aids, those checklists, those written instructions, and a whole ton of apps, odds are. Visual processing strategies are thinking about those physical reactions to print. We know that folks with visual processing challenges might be particularly sensitive to light and contrast. So we need to think about that. Are we faced with fluorescent lighting in our classrooms? Yuck. Is there a window? Can we put those learners close to a window and not under direct fluorescent light? Ask them to explore different ways that might work for them at home. Lights off completely by a window, lamp light that's not directly over their paper, and different colors of paper. Sometimes you can explore different colors in terms of um, the digital screen, right? It would be easy to make sure that you can change the color to maybe a soft yellow, a soft green, a soft blue. So decreasing the contrast of what they're seeing, whether it's on a physical piece of paper or on a computer, can be hugely beneficial. And they can do that on their smartphone, they can do that on their laptop, and they can do that with some colored paper on a photocopy. For communication, step by step, verbal and written, that's all over the place, right? Multiple instructions. A structured phonics reading program might be really successful here because phonics are the jam of people with visual processing challenges. They're good with those sounds. They can decode words like nobody's business. They can spell what they hear. So phonics is great here. And same with the writing and spelling. And then with math, might be just like graph paper, making sure that we're highlighting different things to help them work in columns. 100% Heather. Thank you for that comment. Heather says that these strategies might be helpful working with learners that are older, experiencing issues with their vision. 100%. Organizational processing challenges, again, these are indicative of things like executive functioning challenges, organization, prioritization. So when we're communicating or thinking about interpersonal skills, you might want to maybe wait until the learner, gives you a lot of information about what they want to work on. They might not want to work on things like turn taking or, exploring interpersonal relationships in your classroom, but they might. So it's a good idea to broach that topic when it's organic to those learners. Instructions need to be repeated in multiple formats. We've seen that across all of these different challenge areas. For reading, because there's some difficulty with organization and sometimes formatting and understanding formatting, using pre-reading questions, getting them used to what they're reading is a good idea. In writing, if they have some difficulty with penmanship and that's an issue for them that they need to be able to handwrite. So teaching printing, maybe cursive if they need it, or typing explicitly, right? Let's do a typing tutor program. In math, they might benefit from graph paper or even practicing in columns, again, to make sure that they can stay organized and have a tool that helps them, or simply, work maybe in a spreadsheet or in a table, in a Word document, something that makes it a little bit easier for them. And in terms of accommodations, you really want to think about routine, keeping things the same, making sure that they have scheduled check-ins with you. How is it going? What are the types of things that we could do to support you? And then finally, with directing attention, there are all sorts of things that we could consider. I mean, again, this is kind of outside of our normal day-to-day in adult literacy programs, but encouraging things like regular exercise and a good diet and good sleep patterns. I mean, all of us need to be reminded of these things. But anything that we can bring into our classroom environment around these things are going to be incredibly beneficial if learners can internalize some of this work. Ultimately, we want to consider distractions and be able to reduce those based on that learner's feedback. We need to kind of build in more frequent breaks and movement breaks, making sure that we can get that learner's attention before giving instructions. So waiting for them to task switch, again, with those intentional pauses, really, really helpful. So, hey, Sarah, this is what we're going to do next, blah, 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 will not work. Hey, Sarah, eye contact, then go, works so much better. Repeating instructions, really important. Making sure that there's a lot of feedback and kind of checking in, breaking things apart so that they can work through piece by piece. And really encouraging that feedback, that relationship development, and helping them with some positive self-talk. And I think, I think if I polled all of you, should have done that, will do next time, how many of your learners have difficulty, seeing themselves in a negative way? I bet that percentage is really, really high. And so modeling and encouraging them to talk nicer to themselves and nicer to ourselves while we're doing it is a wonderful learning strategy that can have a huge impact for people. Self-monitoring can be a huge issue for people with organizational processing challenges and difficulties directing attention. And so being mindful again about what works for them and thinking through that as they're learning is a really wonderful activity to help them with their own agency about how they like to learn. Again, a lot of notice about transitions, things like reminders and like how are we working within our time frame, developing priorities. These can be actual like learning activities, lessons, building in ways into our programs for people to do these activities. What's most important for me right now? How do I decide what I'm going to work through today? Things like headphones, quiet places, seating arrangements, all of these things can be really important. And again, encouraging them to figure out what allows them to focus. So people that have difficulties directing attention have a lot of capacity for information. And so they have to be running at 100% to be able to focus 40% on what you're asking them to focus on. So they might have to do a lot of different things at the exact same moment in order to create that focused nature. And then, of course, assistive devices could be really great here as well. So text to speech, so having something read to them, or speech to text, so having it written for them as well. So I had mentioned that there's going to be a couple of handouts coming your way when you get the email about the recording and the slide deck. The learning challenges markers that we went through, those major markers are going to be the first handout, but then there are 4 different strategy lists, many of which we've talked about this afternoon. But of course, briefly, these are handouts that were built to be shared with learners, to be shared with your practitioner teams, whatever makes sense. And they are in those 4 different categories. So they are coming your way in a week's time or so. So we've reached the end of the major content areas that I wanted to talk about today. I really appreciate, again, all the time that you've taken. And sorry, Tom, I didn't see that question. How can we be made aware of any accommodations they require? Oftentimes it might be like a bit of a guess at first. Hey, do you think that you would like to try? I say this all the time. Or so trying to implement some accommodations that you think might be valuable might be a good conversation starter. Hey, let's try this, or what do you think about that? And then it might start to snowball into getting them to open up a little bit about what works and what doesn't. And thank you. The URL to all of the resources are there, and you'll see all of this come to you next week, but also in your inbox. So if there is any questions that you have or anything that really resonated with you, something that you have been doing maybe, because I suspect you are very familiar with a lot of those strategies, but are you seeing them maybe in a different way, or have a couple learners in mind that might benefit from some of those things? So please pop those in the chat and keep the comments and the questions coming. I'm happy to address them. Some key takeaways from today are really, we know that learners are coming with a whole lot, and identifying their strengths and talents and interests will be an invaluable exercise to help them identify the amazing things that we see. And that thinking about these specialized learning strategies will really help them take the next step. Um, as I said in the beginning, LBS practitioners are the greatest strength of this program. You are incredibly knowledgeable. You have a ton of experience. You are passionate, and you're typically really wonderful problem solvers to try and meet people where they're at and to develop strategies that are going to work. I mean, you work in a system that is customizing everything. So looking at customizing learning strategies is just kind of leveling up in that area. But with this, we can help more learners feel more confident in all the things that they have going for them, help them build on top of that to really transition successfully to their next step. Thank you, Brenda, for that feedback. I'm glad that that is helpful. At the end of the deck, you'll notice I've hyperlinked a couple of things here for you in case this has, really piqued your interest and you want to do a little bit more digging. You have a couple of resources here, and any of the references that I used, you might have noticed them to the left there, are all hyperlinked here as well if you would like to do a little bit more reading. Here's my contact information. By all means, if you have a question or a comment about the training, I would welcome that. And that is it. So back over to you, Heather.
Thanks, Sarah. I just want to thank you for the wealth of information you have just provided to us all, not only in helping us to understand the context of the learning challenges that some of our learners may experience, but also the strategies that you've provided so that we have something positive that we can do to help our learners through it, because like many of us are not trained in these learning challenges and what to do. We're learning it as we go, and webinars like this are so very helpful when somebody is as knowledgeable as you. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. And we're getting lots of positive comments in the chat. I'm also going to just take an opportunity right now to thank our ASL interpreters today, Rebecca and Kim. You've done a great job. You had a lot of information to share. And so you've been kept quite busy. So thank you for the great work that you did today and that you always do for us. Appreciate it. Also want to thank Stacy from Contact North, who's been kind of been behind the scenes, but making sure that everything runs smoothly and that this webinar actually happens. So thank you to everybody. Yeah, I think it's been great, and you guys can look forward to receiving all these resources and to you shortly, well, I guess within a week. Yeah, but thank you. Thank you again, Sarah.
Very welcome. Thanks, everybody.
And don't forget, everybody, that there is some additional training in this happening in January, I believe. So if this is something you want to pursue a little bit further, definitely register to take that. Great day, everybody.